All right, welcome everyone. Today we're diving into a fascinating document. It's called A Reflection on Trump Winning the Election.
Very timely, given it's dated November 7th, 2024.
Yeah, literally just dropped, hot off the presses. And, it's not just about the election itself, but what this outcome says about, well, a whole bunch of things. Like, where is democracy at right now?
Democracy, leadership in the digital age.
Exactly, how we handle expertise, or maybe how we don't in this crazy online world.
The author's perspective is interesting right off the bat because their background isn't political science.
Oh, is that right? What's their area?
More from communication, logic, and even philosophy.
So they're coming at this from a different angle, like trying to understand the underlying, the deeper structure of how we're thinking about all this.
Exactly. Like they're framing Trump's reelection as, well, not so much about the guy himself, but as a way to hold a mirror up to democracy's strengths, weaknesses, that whole deal.
Interesting. Does the author lay out their definition of democracy then?
They do. Actually, they even define some other terms right up front, almost like they want to make sure we're all on the same page before they launch into the heavier stuff.
Like what other words are they making sure we're clear on?
Well, democracy, of course, but also like demagogue and even sophist, those pop up quite a bit in the document.
Okay, so already we can see they're bringing in some philosophical ideas here.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about how, democracy is all about equality. Everyone gets an equal say.
Right. One person, one vote.
But then there's this tension because just because everyone's voice is equal, it doesn't mean everyone's opinion is equally informed. You know what I mean?
That's exactly the point the author's getting at. They highlight how democracy, by its very nature, doesn't filter for expertise. Everyone's vote has the same weight, whether they're a leading scientist or, just read one article online.
Oh, okay, yeah, that has huge implications.
Oh.
Especially now, right, with the internet, AI, all that shaping so much of how we see the world. It's almost like,
Everyone has a megaphone now.
yeah. But how do we know which voices are actually worth listening to?
And that ties right into the author's big concern. They see this rise of, well, they call it narcissism, right alongside this devaluation of education. And they argue these two things together create the perfect conditions for demagogues, is the word they use.
Demagogues. Remind me again, what's that exactly?
Well, think back through history. Leaders who were super charismatic may be really appealing on the surface, but their solutions were more about short-term gain, getting people riled up, than about actual long-term well-being.
So are they saying our current, internet-fueled world makes it easier for those kinds of leaders to gain traction?
That seems to be a major part of their argument. They point out how these days we're so bombarded with information all the time, we tend to crave easy answers.
Oh, 100%. It's overwhelming.
And demagogues, they thrive on that, offering quick fixes, tapping into emotion, even if it's not the most logical or ultimately beneficial approach.
And this is where they bring in that analogy, right? The Candyman versus doctor thing.
Yeah.
That really stuck with me.
Oh, it's brilliant.
So break it down for us. Candyman versus doctor. How do these relate to leadership?
Okay, so the Candyman leader, they're all about the instant gratification. Think sugary treats that make you feel good right now, but, maybe not the best choice long term. The doctor, on the other hand, might give you medicine that's hard to swallow, maybe some lifestyle changes you don't want to make.
Tough love, right.
But ultimately, the doctor is focused on your actual well-being, even if it's not the most popular choice at first.
Okay, so how does Trump fit into all of this? Is the author directly saying he's the Candyman in this scenario?
They don't explicitly say it, no. But they do heavily imply that Candyman leaders have an easier time gaining support, especially when voters maybe don't have the knowledge or experience to really judge what they're being promised.
That makes a lot of sense. We've all seen those politicians, right? Promise you the moon and the stars, but
Deliver. Not so much.
it really makes you think about what we as voters are drawn to. Are we looking for that quick sugar rush, even if it might lead to problems later? Or are we willing to do the hard work, maybe make some sacrifices for something better in the long run?
That's the big question the author wants us grappling with. And this whole dilemma gets even more complicated when you factor in how the internet and AI are changing the game entirely.
Right, because on one hand, the internet, it's amazing. Access to information, connecting with people. I mean, I can't even imagine life without Google Maps anymore.
Totally. The convenience, the possibilities, it's incredible. But the author is careful to point out the dark side of this, too.
Oh, for sure. Like misinformation spreading online. Cybersecurity issues, which frankly scare me a little.
And then there's the algorithms, right? Creating those echo chambers where we're only seeing what confirms what we already believe. It's almost like a double-edged sword, like you said.
A very sharp sword in some cases. And they even talk about deep fakes, which are just, I don't even know what to say about those, honestly.
They're unnerving.
Have you ever seen those videos where it looks like someone is saying or doing something, but it's completely fake?
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder of how easily things can be manipulated these days. And that brings us back to the author's point about critical thinking being more crucial than ever.
It's not enough to just be informed anymore, right?
Yeah.
You have to be like super informed, super critical.
Otherwise, you're just being swept along by the current, by whatever's trending.
And that takes effort. Effort that, frankly, not everyone is willing to put in.
And that's where I think the author's argument about the need for what they call virtues in leadership becomes really important.
Virtues, like what kind of virtues are we talking about here?
They list a bunch: honesty, obviously, but also integrity, empathy, wisdom, courage. It's almost like they're saying these qualities aren't just for politicians, they're for all of us.
Yeah, like those are the building blocks of being a decent human being, not just a good leader.
Exactly. And the author contrasts these with, like, the non-virtuous traits, deception, arrogance, lack of empathy. They argue when leaders lack these core virtues, it erodes trust.
Makes sense. If the people in charge aren't modeling those qualities, how can we expect anyone else to?
Right. It creates polarization, leads to short-sighted decisions that weaken society overall.
So thinking about those virtues the author laid out, what about for you personally? What are the non-negotiables when you're looking at a leader? What makes you say, okay, this is someone I can trust?
That's such a good question to ask ourselves because it reveals what we truly value. For me, honestly, it always comes back to, are they honest? Do they have integrity? Are they actually competent?
Those are good ones, especially in this world where it feels like truth and expertise are under constant attack.
Oh, and speaking of expertise, that takes us to the next part of the document, which gets pretty deep. They go into narcissism, the internet, and this whole thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Have you heard of that?
I think so. Refresh my memory. What is that exactly?
It's this cognitive bias where people who, well, let's just say they don't know much about something, they tend to overestimate their own competence. Like, they're blind to how much they don't know.
Okay, yeah, I've definitely met some people like that.
And the author argues this effect is even worse now because of the internet. Think about it. We have so much information available all the time. It's easy to feel like an expert after reading a few articles or, watching some YouTube videos.
Right, but that's not real expertise, is it?
No. The author compares it to, like, a trained pilot versus someone who's just played a flight simulator game, or a surgeon versus someone who's watched a surgery on TV.
Okay, yeah, I get it. Big difference. But how do we avoid falling into that trap ourselves? How do we tell the difference between, actual expertise and this illusion of expertise the author's talking about?
That's where critical thinking comes back in. It's about being aware of our own biases, questioning what we assume is true, seeking out different viewpoints.
So it's almost like we need to be skeptical of our own certainty. The more sure we are about something, the more we should question whether that's actually justified.
Exactly. And this all goes back to the author's point about education being a privilege, but one that comes with a responsibility. It's not just about taking in information, it's about what you do with it, how you think about it.
Which then raises another question. Not everyone has access to the same quality of education, right? So how do we even begin to tackle that?
That's the crux of it. How do we value expertise without silencing people who maybe didn't have the same opportunities to learn? How do we ensure decisions are actually informed by knowledge without shutting down those other voices?
Feels like we're walking a tightrope here. Expertise on one side and inclusivity on the other.
And that's a tension the author tackles head on, especially when they bring back that Candyman versus doctor idea to illustrate how this all plays out in the context of inclusion.
Oh, I'm interested to hear how that analogy works in this context. But first, I think we need to take a break.
So picking up where we left off, that whole Candyman versus doctor thing in the context of inclusion, it's tricky.
Yeah, how does that analogy even apply here?
Well, think about it. A Candyman leader, they might try to exploit the desire for inclusion, right? By telling everyone exactly what they want to hear, even if it's not true, not realistic.
Oh, I see. So they're using inclusion, but in a manipulative way.
Exactly. Pandering to different groups, making promises they can't keep, all just to gain popularity.
And a doctor leader, how will they handle this differently?
A doctor leader gets the importance of inclusion, but they also recognize sometimes tough decisions have to be made, even if those decisions aren't popular with everyone.
So it's about finding that balance between acknowledging different viewpoints, but also making sure decisions are based on, facts, expertise.
Exactly. And that leads into this idea of false equivalence, which the author brings up a lot. They're basically saying we can't treat every opinion as equally valid, especially when it comes to really complex issues that require specialized knowledge.
Right. Not everyone's an expert on climate change or economics or, healthcare policy.
And the author seems to be arguing that's where we get into trouble, when we start giving equal weight to opinions that are based on, let's say, feelings or personal beliefs versus opinions that are grounded in years of study, research, experience.
Okay, but how do we decide whose expertise to trust? Because even experts sometimes disagree with each other.
It's tricky, for sure. But the author seems to suggest there are ways to evaluate sources, to assess someone's credibility. They talk about looking for evidence-based arguments, checking for biases, considering the broader context of someone's expertise.
So it's not about blindly trusting anyone who claims to be an expert. It's about being critical, even of those who, on the surface, seem to know what they're talking about.
And that loops right back to the importance of education, not just in the formal sense, but like cultivating that lifelong curiosity, that desire to learn and grow.
And to be open to changing our minds.
Right.
Right, like being willing to admit when we're wrong.
That's huge. It's about recognizing we all have biases, we all make mistakes, and that's okay. What matters is how do we respond to that? Do we dig our heels in, or are we willing to be open to new information, even if it challenges what we thought we knew?
It's hard, though, isn't it, to admit you were wrong? Especially when it comes to, deeply held beliefs or political views.
It's super hard, but the author makes a compelling case for why it's so essential, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. They talk about how this inability to change our minds, to have those difficult conversations where we might be proven wrong, it fuels division.
Makes sense. Like everyone's just stuck in their own echo chambers, shouting at each other. No one's actually listening.
Yeah, and that's not how progress happens. Real progress requires dialogue. It requires a willingness to understand where the other side is coming from, even if we don't ultimately agree with them.
Okay, so how do we break out of that cycle? How do we move from, shouting matches to actual conversations that can lead to some kind of, positive change?
Well, the author doesn't offer a magic solution, but they do suggest some starting points. And again, it comes back to education, to fostering critical thinking skills. They also talk about the importance of virtuous leadership, of having leaders who model those qualities of honesty, integrity, empathy, and wisdom.
It's like we need both individual change, A&D systemic change. People need to be better thinkers, but also our systems, our institutions, they need to support that kind of thinking.
Right. It's about creating a culture where it's okay to disagree, where it's okay to change your mind, where evidence and reason are valued over just, yelling the loudest or being the most aggressive.
Which, let's be honest, is pretty rare these days.
Yeah.
Especially online. It feels like everyone's just trying to win the argument.
Yeah.
No one cares about actually understanding each other.
And the author is pushing back against that. They're saying, look, we're all in this together, whether we like it or not. We might have different opinions, different backgrounds, but ultimately, we all share a common humanity.
And we all have to live on this planet together, right? So we might as well figure out a way to, coexist peacefully.
Exactly. And that requires a certain level of humility, a willingness to step outside of our own little bubbles and engage with those who are different from us.
Which can be scary. I mean,
Yeah.
It's much easier to just stick with people who agree with us, who validate our worldview.
It is easier, but it's not necessarily what's best for us in the long run. The author seems to believe that real growth, both individually and as a society, comes from embracing that discomfort, that uncertainty that comes with encountering different perspectives, different ways of thinking.
So it's not about silencing those voices we disagree with. It's about finding a way to have those conversations constructively, even when they're difficult.
Exactly. And it's about being willing to admit when we're wrong, to change our minds when presented with new evidence, to recognize that we don't have all the answers.
Which takes courage, right? It's much easier to just dig our heels in and defend our position,
Yeah.
even when we know deep down we might be wrong.
It does take courage. And it takes a certain level of trust, too. Trust in the process, trust in each other, even when we disagree.
And that's something the author seems to be really concerned about, the erosion of trust in our society.
They see it as a major threat to democracy. They write about how when we lose trust in each other, when we lose trust in our institutions, it creates a breeding ground for division, for manipulation, for all sorts of problems.
Makes sense. If you can't trust anyone, how can you build anything together? How can you work towards common goals?
Exactly. And the author's argument seems to be that's exactly what those Candyman leaders exploit, right? That lack of trust. They come in offering simple solutions, easy answers, preying on people's fears and anxieties.
And it's so tempting to fall for that, especially when the world feels so complex and uncertain.
Absolutely. It's human nature to crave certainty, to want to believe that someone has all the answers. But the author's message is clear. There are no easy answers. There are no quick fixes. The challenges we face as individuals and as a society require us to be engaged, informed, and critical thinkers. They require us to be willing to have those tough conversations, to challenge our own beliefs, to be open to new information, and to work together even when we disagree.
So it's not about finding the right answer. It's about the process of seeking truth together.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that that process is ongoing, it's messy, it's imperfect, but it's also essential for a healthy democracy.
It's like democracy is a verb, not a noun. It's something we have to actively do, not just something we passively observe.
I love that. Democracy is a verb. That's a great way to put it. And it perfectly encapsulates the author's call to action. They're saying, look, we can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix things. We have to be active participants in shaping the future we want to see.
And that starts with taking responsibility for our own thinking, our own actions, our own choices.
Right. It's about being informed, about being engaged, about being willing to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's hard. And it's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that our choices impact not just ourselves, but the entire community, the entire world.
It's a big responsibility, but it's also empowering, right? To know that we have that agency, that ability to make a difference.
Absolutely. And that's a message I think we could all use a little more of these days. A reminder that even in the face of challenges, we have the power to create a better future if we're willing to do the work.
Speaking of work, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have, but there's still so much to unpack.
Yeah, the author's reflection is like, it's so dense, so full of ideas. We could probably spend another hour just talking about their take on education or the role of technology in shaping our worldviews.
And their insights on leadership, on the importance of virtues, on the dangers of narcissism. I mean, there's just so much here.
And yet it all feels connected, doesn't it? Like it's all part of this larger tapestry of how we understand ourselves, each other, and the world around us.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this reflection so compelling. It's not just about a single event. It's about the human condition, about the challenges and opportunities we face as we navigate this increasingly complex and interconnected world.
It's about what it means to be a citizen, a member of a community, a human being trying to make sense of it all.
Beautifully put. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through the author's insightful reflection. We hope it sparked some ideas, some questions, and maybe even a little bit of hope for the future. And remember, democracy is not a spectator sport. It's something we create together every single day.
You know, as we wrap this up, I keep thinking the author could have just been bummed about the election, right? But they went way deeper.
Oh, absolutely. They turned it into this whole reflection on, like, the big picture. Where are we, as a society, democracy, leadership, all of that. And their background, it really shows communication, logic, philosophy. It's structured so well.
It's not just like ranting or complaining. It's methodical, like almost a logical proof. But using these analogies that make it like click for anyone.
The Candyman thing, I'm telling you, that's genius. I bet anyone listening right now can picture some leader who's all about that quick fix, the easy solution, even if it screws things up long term.
It's so true. And that's where their point about critical thinking comes in. It's like they're not telling us what to think, but how to think.
Be more discerning. Question stuff. Don't just go with your gut reaction all the time.
And those are skills everyone needs, not just like politicians or professors.
Everyday life stuff, making choices, big and small, figuring out what to believe in this crazy world.
And amidst all the sort of doom and gloom, they do have this thread of hope, I think.
I noticed that too. It's not all bad news. They're concerned, but not like giving up.
They keep coming back to that idea we have power to change things. We're not helpless.
And that's where education comes in, right?
Mm.
Like empowering people to think for themselves.
Lifelong learning, being curious, being open to changing your mind. That's where it starts.
It's funny, though, because they're also kind of saying democracy itself isn't enough. like just having the right to vote.
Right. It's not some magical fix. It has to be paired with this active engagement from citizens.
If people aren't informed, if they're not thinking critically, then, well, democracy doesn't work so well.
And that's their call to action, I think. It's on each of us to step up.
Not wait for someone else to fix it, to be the change, you know?
And that change starts with, honestly, looking inward. What are my biases? What am I taking for granted? Am I willing to be wrong about something?
That's hard, though. Admitting you were wrong about something you felt strongly about.
Oh, tell me about it.
Well,
But they make such a good case for why it's essential. Not just for you, but for everyone.
like, that's how we bridge divides. That's how we actually move forward.
If we're all just stuck defending our own little corner, nothing gets done.
And the world has some pretty big problems that need solving, right?
Exactly. So their reflection, to me, it's this reminder that we have to find ways to talk to each other, even when it's hard.
To understand where the other side's coming from, even if we never fully agree.
And that's, it's messy. It's uncomfortable. But it's crucial. It's the only way we're going to get through this, honestly.
So their reflection on the election, it becomes this much bigger reflection on, like, the human condition itself.
How we communicate, how we relate to each other, how we build a future together, despite our differences.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
We have.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Hope you found this as thought-provoking as we did. And remember, the future's not set in stone. We have a say in how it unfolds.